For today's webinar, we have Jody Wolf from the City of Phoenix Police Department presenting Building in an Unbiased Laboratory Culture. Without further delay, here is Jody.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the ASCLD Trained Directors series. My name is Jody Wolf, and I'm going to be talking about building an unbiased laboratory culture. We'll start with a normal, typical disclaimer. The presentation is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace independent professional judgment. The opinions expressed in this presentation and on the following slides are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily those of the Phoenix Police Department or ASCLD. Neither the Phoenix Police Department or ASCLD endorses or approves, assumes no responsibility for the content, accuracy, or completeness of the information presented. The content of this presentation is the property of the presenter. In other words, these are my opinions. So let's jump right in. Let's go over the goals for the presentation today. We're going to talk about what is bias and how it relates specifically to forensic science and why it's important, and what types of impacts it has on our work processes and our work product. How can we minimize or mitigate that impact? What key components exist within our normal operations that we can take advantage of to help minimize and mitigate the risks of bias? We're also going to talk about what those risks are and what symptoms you may observe if you have a biased culture. And then we're going to go through 4 examples of laboratories and programs that have implemented some of these strategies to minimize the impact of bias. We'll round up today with a final question and answer period. So let's jump right in. We're going to start with a brief video that talks about what bias is in forensic science.
So where do our beliefs and opinions come from? And how do we make sense of the world that we live in? We like to think that we're able to make judgments and decisions about the world around us in an objective and logical way. But this is not necessarily the case because of the way that our brain processes and stores information. In everyday life, we are exposed to a huge amount of information. And this information differs for everybody because we don't experience life exactly in the same way. And in order for your brain to make sense of the world that you live in and process all of this information, it will use filters and shortcuts. And this is all extremely beneficial because that filter will optimize the information processing. Why do we, for example, during election season, only tend to look for information that paints our favorite political party in a good light, and look for and remember information that will cast our opposing political parties in a negative light? Regardless of what political party you're voting for, you would never go out and Google negative information about them. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias, which could be described as the human tendency to selectively gather and process information in order to confirm our assumptions and preconceptions, whether they are true or not. Decades of research within psychology and social science have shown that confirmation bias does not only affect how we gather information, but also how we process and remember information. The bottom line is that we as humans tend to weigh evidence that supports our prior belief to a greater degree than evidence that will contradict them. Everybody is biased, it's just part of human nature. So how does this relate to the criminal justice system and forensic science? If we take forensic science as an example, one experiment looked into initial exposure to context at a crime scene to look at whether or not if you're exposed to a certain type of context initially, will that affect how you make interpretations at a later stage? And this specific experiment considered forensic, archaeology, and anthropology excavations, where participants were asked to excavate burials with cast skeletal remains that were male, and they were dressed in female clothing. And what happened was that the students who excavated the skeleton that had female clothing, later on when they were asked to assess that skeleton, it affected the way that they interpret that male skeleton, compared to, for example, the control group and the people who were exposed to gender-neutral clothing, showing a difference in the interpretation of that same skeleton. And this is not to say that forensic scientists are bad people doing bad things, but this has to do with the fact that as humans, our brains are subject to limitations. We need to take steps in order to minimize cognitive and confirmation bias in forensic science to the best of our abilities. One proposed way of doing this is to shield forensic examiners from irrelevant contextual information that could be of a biasing nature. For example, if the suspect has confessed prior to you looking at the evidence, you don't necessarily need to have that piece of information when, for example, evaluating the fingerprint or looking at the skeleton. What happens at the crime scene will follow up all the way through court. So if you get it wrong at the beginning, it's most likely going to go wrong all the way. And taking a more holistic approach to these types of phenomena is extremely important in order to understand the whole process. It's not enough to simply just have the knowledge of cognitive biases. Education alone will not combat cognitive biases, but there are procedures that we could implement within the forensic science process that could help us minimize and to some extent control that we don't get affected by these.
So as I was preparing for today's lecture, I started out trying to just do a literature search to see what available information was out there. And as Sherry mentions in her video, this topic of bias has been studied quite extensively throughout the history of social science and psychology. But pre-2009, with the advent of the NAS report, we didn't hear a significant amount of discussion or see a lot of research with regard to bias and its impact in forensics. And the one thing that I think, at least that my preconception was that, bias is a bad thing. And we don't have bias in forensic science. And then with the research and the effort into understanding bias and its impact in forensic science, what I've come to learn is that bias isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It depends on how we deal with it. And one of those things is understanding that bias occurs regardless of what we necessarily think bias is, because it's a function and a consequence of the way that our brains process information. And it's the impact of heuristics on the processing of information and associated conclusions reached. So we take huge amounts of information in, we process that information in extremely short periods of time and reach a conclusion. And what happens is this is a systematic error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting that information in the world around them that ultimately impacts the decisions and judgments that they make. So they process the information, they reach a conclusion, and that conclusion may or may not be in terms of accurate, precise, or correct. So we're all susceptible to bias because this is literally the way that our brains process information. And we do it to make it easy, to simplify information processing so we can quickly reach those conclusions. And this has been important to the way that humans interact with each other, process and interact with the world around them, but it can lead us astray. So what we want to do today is talk about this concept of bias in the laboratory and in the practice of forensic science, and what can we do as leaders to minimize the impact of that bias so that we do reach the best conclusions possible, and we have confidence in our work product, and that our work product has credibility when introduced to our stakeholders, whether that's an investigator, a prosecutor, a judge, a jury, a defense attorney, whatever forum in which that decision maker exists, that they have the best possible work product that we can provide. So let's talk a little bit about the types of cognitive bias that exist. This is just a sampling, those that, in my opinion, we probably engage with most often. And you'll have heard of confirmation and contextual bias, probably, as we've been talking about bias more frequently in forensics and in leadership positions. One of the things I did when preparing for this presentation is I did a lit search, and I used two search terms, forensics and bias, and there were more than 3,300 results. So there has been an extensive amount of work, a lot of it done recently in this area, and I encourage you, as you're interested interested, because I'm just going to introduce topics today, is as you delve deeper into these topics to really do your homework and take a look at them. But here's just a sampling of the types of cognitive bias that may impact our operations. This includes confirmation bias, which really involves our pre-existing beliefs, expectations, motives, and situations that influence our hypotheses prior to our analysis. This can ultimately alter the collection, perception, and interpretation of the evidence. Contextual bias includes other information that something is connected to the case that we're working on. So we apply different weights to that information, which results impacting our conclusions. We have motivational bias. This has two components to it: accuracy and direction. The individual completing an analysis tries to form a conclusion based on the results being accurate. And from a directional perspective, the individual completing an analysis seeking a particular desired outcome of their analysis, often being influenced particularly by the role that they play in the criminal justice system, by engaging with stakeholders, things like that. Expectancy cognitive bias deals with a predetermined expectation of what will be found, and that this expectation alters the results. The result is consistent with their expectations. We have anchoring bias. This is the tendency to rely too heavily on the very first piece of information that you learn. And then this first piece guides all of the following activities and tasks and results. We have the attentional bias. This is the tendency to pay attention to some things while simultaneously ignoring others. Availability bias. This is placing greater value on information that comes to your mind quickly. So those thoughts that we initially have, we put too much weight on those initial thoughts. False consensus includes the tendency to overestimate how much other people agree with you. So like when we're going through our verification and technical and administrative review process. And then we have functional bias, and this is the tendency to see objects as only working in a particular way. So we believe and put too much confidence in the steps of our methodology without understanding how those steps interact and interplay with each other to understand whether or not they're performing as expected. So why do we need to talk about bias? Why is it important? Well, it goes back to the credibility that we have within the criminal justice system and the overall quality of our work product. As you all know, and I'm sure are very familiar with, we have forensic science, crime laboratories, forensic experts, have a multitude of critics that have been incredibly vocal. In my opinion, it has made us better. We have improved the practice of forensic science over the past generation, the past 20 years, to an extreme extent in publications like the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward, has helped bring light to these issues. That was reinforced by the PCAST report that was published a few years after that. And then a multitude of other publications, in particular law reviews, that talk about the issues with forensic science. And I think that it has really brought to light some of our opportunities, our greatest opportunities for improvement, and the awareness and the understanding of the impact that bias has on our overall processes is one of those things that we have learned. And that's why we're talking about it today. And that goes to our credibility in a court of law, into our stakeholders, as well as impacting the overall quality of our work product. And that's why we need to talk about it. That's why we're here today, is to understand what bias is, how it impacts our operations, what we can do to address it, and some of those examples in which laboratories have put into place policies, procedures, and practices to help control the impact of bias. So I ask you, are we immune to bias? I've seen lots of documentation in literature articles in which forensic scientists often claim they are taught to disregard biasing information that they receive. We're objective scientists. We're not susceptible to the impact of bias. That is not a true statement because bias is a result of the way that our brains process information and we reach conclusions. We are not immune to bias. We are affected by bias. This is borne out in when we look at other scientific fields, as we talked about early on in our presentation today, that the fields of social science and psychology have looked at the impact of bias and what it is for decades. And virtually all other scientific fields have determined that the risk of harm due to observer effects is so great, combined with the need for valid findings being so important, that they often conduct blind studies. So when we look at the approval process for pharmaceutical products, before they ever make it to market, before they ever get put into use, you have these clinical studies in which blind studies are incorporated. Blind studies are important because bias is real. And so we need to understand that we are not immune to the impact of bias. And we have to recognize that and take a look at ourselves about how we can mitigate, minimize, and control the impact of bias. Notice I didn't say eliminate, because you can't eliminate it. You can't eliminate the way you think and process information. So it's impossible to get rid of it. But what we need to do is incorporate an infrastructure that's multi-level into our operations that allow us to have awareness, to control, to mitigate the risks of the impact of bias, and ensure and support the overall increased work product quality of our work product. So we're going to walk through these options or these possibilities to minimize and mitigate the impact of bias. They include risk management. That's where we're going to start. That should sound familiar to all of you if you're coming from an accredited laboratory, to ISO IEC 17025 that was published in 2017 for testing and calibration laboratories. A component of that deals specifically with looking at your operations from a risk management perspective. We're going to talk about leadership engagement, organizational structure, awareness and understanding, how you can use policy and practice to create and formalize that infrastructure, and then transparency. So first, let's talk about risk management. As I mentioned, those of you who come from accredited laboratories should be very familiar with this framework, looking at how our operations, the various tasks, duties, and inputs ultimately affect the output from a risk management perspective. I found one approach in particular that seemed to be very effective from Forensic Science South Australia. And what they did was take this risk management approach to looking at bias and its impact on their operations. And what they did is they formed a working group, and they did an internal review, an assessment of the risks associated at all the various steps of their operations with a particular focus on bias. And then they brainstormed how could they treat these risks, how could they mitigate those risks, and then developed a list of recommendations. This working group was from all across the laboratory, a diverse group of senior scientists in particular, who completed the risk assessment. The risk assessment included identifying the risk with a description, what caused the risk, what is the potential exposure to people inside the laboratory, what are the existing controls in place to address that risk, is that control effective or not effective, what are the consequences of that risk, what is the likelihood of that risk occurring, what is the level of the risk, low, medium, high, or extreme? What are the options that we have to address that risk? And then who ultimately is responsible for within the organization to address those risks? And so I think that this is a really great way to take a look inside your laboratory about what the impact of bias is, specifically with bias. And I'll say this, you can use this risk management approach for all aspects of your laboratory. In particular, in your quality system, bias and mitigating bias is certainly related to quality because we're talking about the quality of our overall work product. So you incorporate bias as a part of your risk management approach to your quality system and identify some of those recommendations that allow you to control those risks. Obviously, leaders being engaged in this process is key. You need a champion to the process. You need your leaders to support and understand what bias is, why it's important to understand what bias is, what the consequences of bias impacting your operations are, and what current and contribute to those systems, such as policy and practice, that allow you to mitigate those impacts. Leaders need to empower their employees, but also be engaged in the accountability piece. And then I'm always a huge proponent of transparency. And this all contributes to that quality system and the dimming cycle of plan, do, check, act. It's an ongoing commitment to continuous improvement so that the organization is a learning organization, not just about topics such as bias, but all aspects related to the quality system and your operations. But leadership engagement is really critical piece and foundational part of that, building a culture that is aware of bias and works to minimize its impact. Organizational structure. This is often when we talk about laboratories being independent and autonomous. And so many of the recommendations that have been made to forensic science, whether you look at the NAS report, PCAST, the National Commission on Forensic Science, if you look at those recommendations, they suggest that laboratories should be independent from law enforcement and prosecutors' offices. What I will tell you is that regardless of the organizational structure, laboratories must be independent and autonomous, and you can achieve that through formal organizational structure, contract with stakeholders, policies, and practice. Take, for example, a private laboratory. My laboratory is a SACI site. We've engaged with multiple vendors, and we send sexual assault kits to them, and they process them. Those private laboratories' primary customer is largely law enforcement agencies. So law enforcement agencies all over the United States are engaging with these private laboratories. Just because the laboratory is private does not mean that they are necessarily protected from undue influence as a result of a significant stakeholder that has an interest in their operations. So just because you're an independent agency or private laboratory or associated with a law enforcement agency, does that mean that you're predisposed to bias or not predisposed to bias? It takes more than that. And it really is understanding what it takes to be independent and autonomous. Do you have the ability to make decisions about your operations, the scientific procedures? Are your employees supported when they make a difficult call and it's not what the stakeholder wanted? Do you have those systems in place that really support that independence and autonomy of your operations, and not just of your overall organization, but of each individual within that organization that contributes to the executing the mission of that organization? This is, if you can't tell, this is one of those things that I'm super passionate about. Because I think it's if you look at organizational structure, that's a very surface view. And it takes more than just that initial organizational structure to support autonomy and independence. Next, we have awareness and understanding. Bias is a real thing, as we've talked about. I mean, that's the way our brains function. And so we need to build this into our cultures for our staff, for our employees, throughout their life cycle as they engage in your organization. So this includes employee onboarding. Bias should be a part of that discussion. When you onboard your employee, not only are you talking about how do you log into systems, here's the quality system, here's your policy and procedures manual, you're going to be in forensic biology, here's your training manual. You're going to actually talk through some of these concepts like quality, ethics. What are your duties as an employee? What is bias and what is its impact? One of the things that I do for employee onboarding is I meet with every single new employee that comes into our laboratory. As I mentioned, I'm the lab director for the Phoenix Police Department's crime laboratory. We serve the 5th largest city in the United States. We have roughly 155 authorized positions. And so I meet with every single new employee. And one of the things that I do with them, not only in their formal onboarding process, I have a casual conversation and we talk about various aspects, but we talk specifically about bias and undue influence. And what I want to do is ingrain that thought process with them as soon as they become a part of our organization. that we have to have this awareness and why it's important and how it can unintentionally impact us and have unexpected and sometimes adverse consequences. So we really want people to think about that process and challenge their own biases. Awareness and understanding are the key foundations for individuals so that they can engage with the systems that you design as a leader that mitigate and minimize the impact of biases. However, it can't be a one-time event for your employees. It needs to be ongoing. So whether that's annual, semi-annual, isolated webinars, we do all of those things here in my laboratory that talk about ethics. What are our quality system duties? Continually, how do we mitigate the impact of not only bias, but other things that affect the quality of our work product? That includes a look at our technical procedures. It has to be an ongoing, continuous engaging type of approach with your employees. So it's important to really take a look at this, not only as your employees come on and join your system, but as they work and are part of your overall team. One of the things that we really emphasize in our quality system duties is that those measures that every individual is responsible for that relate to this part of it. So just again, to emphasize that it has to be a continuous effort, ongoing, as a part of your system. And when we talk about continuous improvement, as research continues to develop and make recommendations, that needs to inform all of the processes that we're talking about today so that you can continually improve them for your laboratory and ultimately for your stakeholders. Policy and practice, I really see this as your, like if you frame a house, if you're building a house and the frame, this is the frame of our laboratory, our policy and practice. So we take information, we take research, we take best practice, we look at our quality system, we look at our accreditation requirements, we look at all of that and we build policy and practice to live within that frame, to live within that house. And so you can design your policies and your practices with these topics in mind, in particular bias is what we're talking about today. And one of the recommendations that come out of research that is targeted towards forensic science is limiting the amount of irrelevant information that can influence a practitioner as they're processing evidence, interpreting data, reaching conclusions. And so they recommend that we have these measures in place that really minimize and limit access to information and extraneous, irrelevant case information that could unduly influence the analysts. Recommended sequential unmasking. So that, again, that's just another version of controlling and accessing information. And then the utilization of blind testing. There's lots of different forms. One of the things that the National Commission on Forensic Science came out with was blind proficiency testing. So an analyst wouldn't know that the item of evidence that they received for analysis was actually a proficiency test. Current practices for proficiency tests is that analysts are largely aware that it's a proficiency test. So blind proficiency testing would be a situation in which an item of evidence looks like a case item of evidence. You can't tell the difference. So these are all things that you can do to build policy and practice around these concepts to help support some of these recognized best practices to help minimize and mitigate the impact of bias within your laboratories. But these aren't the only policies and practices that you can build inside your systems. As I mentioned on the prior slide, we talk about quality system duties. So a duty to report, a duty to be professional and maintain your competency in order to perform your job duties as a forensic scientist within your laboratory. The utilization of other quality assurance and quality control policies, procedures, duties, those all can contribute to minimizing the impact of bias. And so it's this multi-level approach that comes from all these different angles when you look at your laboratory that ultimately really impacts and minimizes bias in your operations. Transparency, is one of those things that I really believe rounds out this opportunity to look at mitigating bias. And it's the final component that we're going to talk about today. And I encourage you all to consider opening your laboratory to all of your stakeholders. So often we mostly engage with law enforcement, regardless of your organizational structure, whether you're associated with a law enforcement agency, whether you're a private lab or an independent forensic science institution, you still engage because of the way our criminal justice system is designed, with an investigation having to come first. You're going to engage with law enforcement. But you really need to provide open access and equal access to all of your stakeholders. So that includes members of the community. It includes judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, all of those individuals that have a stake in the outcome of your laboratory's work product. This includes access to documents, processes, training those individuals, providing tours. So what you see here is a picture of one of my analysts who's giving a tour. This is actually to the Inn of Courts, which is a attorney professional organization. Attorney, that's really the caveat. And we had 50 people come in and tour our laboratory and take a look at how we do business. Making your documents publicly available. What about your quality system documents? If a defense attorney calls you, is your analyst going to answer that question, or are they going to go ask their boss first if they can answer the question or not? Sometimes that's case dependent on where the case is in its life. But we answer defense attorney questions, and which was a really mind-blowing concept when I started my career almost 21 years ago. I can remember my supervisor telling me, don't ever trust them. And that's not the case. That's not the reality. They want to understand. And I remember very clearly as I was having a conversation with one of the judges here in the state, and we were talking about this concept of training officers of the court. So whether they're a defense attorney, a prosecutor, a judge in forensic science, it was one of the things that we were doing to address the recommendations that were made from the NAS report. And he asked me this question: do we need to train them separately? Do we need to have a class for defense attorneys? Do we need to have a class for prosecutors? And do we need to have a class for judges? Selfishly, again, being transparent, from a resource perspective, to staff those 3 classes in which I teach the same content was really inefficient. And when I think about it, if I get asked a question related to my role in the laboratory, whether I'm an analyst or as a member of the leadership team, my answer doesn't change. I mean, we're dealing with scientific processes, right? And my vocabulary might change. So if I'm talking to my daughter, I may use different language so that she can understand and comprehend what I'm saying, as opposed to if I'm talking to one of my colleagues who's a lab director for another lab here in the United States. We're going to use different vocabulary, but talk about the same things, but the answer is the same. So let's train everybody all in the same room. Let's put prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges all in the same room and talk about it. And one of the best things that came out of that experience, which is called the Arizona Forensic Science Academy, if you're interested, is that we created relationships with all of our stakeholders, regardless of their role, because we're invested and interested in forensic science, understanding the underlying scientific principles, the limitations, the overall work processes, the quality system documents. Opening up yourselves to your stakeholders, regardless of role, is an important part of minimizing and mitigating the impact of bias. So what are the risks that we have? And I'm going to take a really high-level view, a global view. I think that you could take a look at any particular case and identify specific risks, but we're going to talk about it from an overall holistic perspective. And we're going to start with this discussion with culture. Culture's a significant impact and a significant factor to risk in either promulgating the impact of bias or minimizing the risk of bias. And cultures really exist on multiple levels within your organization. You're going to have cliques, you're going to have sections that will have their own culture. I mean, how many of your laboratories have your DNA section has one culture and your firearms section has a completely different culture? And then you have an overall laboratory culture. And so I encourage you to take a pretty critical view of your own cultures and ask yourself this question: are we susceptible to the risk of bias? And if we are, how do we go through and address it? And that gets into that risk management process that I described to you earlier. We are so heavily engaged in the investigative process. That's next on our list of risks. Depending on what kind of laboratory that you have, whether you have crime scene or not, whether your scientists go out into the field or not, and they stand shoulder to shoulder in a homicide scene with an investigator talking about the scene. We are heavily embedded with the investigative process. That is a high risk situation for the impact of bias. And we talked about all those different kinds of bias that would come into play in those types of situations. So again, that awareness, policy, procedure, practice is an important component in mitigating the risk of being engaged so much in the investigative process so early on in the life of that case. Our adversarial legal system doesn't help with us mitigating those risks. Often in a court of law, we have prosecutors and defense attorneys proposing alternate hypotheses, often in a very, obviously it's adversarial because that's the system that we have, but it can get really heated. And people could take that personally, and then they can bring those personal biases back. They can bring them back to the lab, or a prosecutor could talk to a forensic scientist. That bias can rub off. So it's important to talk about how our legal system creates a framework that introduces a risk of the impact of bias. Our toxicology analysts testify more than anybody else in the laboratory, and defense attorneys and prosecutors that present cases in toxicology and DUI cases, at least in Arizona, can be really, really confrontational. So we have to be able to separate ourselves from that. We don't have a stake in the outcome. We are not pro-police. We are not pro-prosecution. We are not pro-defense. I'm pro-science. And that's what we really need to help our analysts understand, is we're here to impart our expertise and help the triers of fact understand what that means. Undue influence is another risk. And I see this often, just to be candid and transparent with you, often with prosecutors and investigators. I give this example to our new employees when I meet with them, because I want to give them an example of what undue influence will be. And I often tell them, no one's going to be around when you do this. When you are subjected to undue influence, no one else is going to be present. The prosecutor is going to come to you and they're going to say, I'm going to ask you this question. I want you to answer this way. As a scientist, I need to answer in my own words with my own expertise and make sure that it's substantiated with the work that I've done and I'm not overstating my conclusions. We want to be able to have systems in place to be able to help our employees navigate those experiences successfully. And then access to irrelevant information. Build your systems so that information that's irrelevant to the execution of their duties is not necessarily readily available to them, so that we can eliminate the introduction of that task irrelevant information into their overall process. Here's some of the symptoms, most specifically on an individual level. When you're impacted by bias, you're only paying attention to information that confirms your own opinion. If we're looking at data and we have, again, you have to think about the way the brain processes information. We can't only pay attention to the information that confirms our opinion. We have to look at the totality of the information available to us. Blame outside factors. So always blame the defense. That's not the appropriate process here. Taking personal credit for accomplishments that we shouldn't. Like I said, we're not pro-police. We're not pro-prosecutors. We're not pro-defense. I'm pro-science. And then we assume that all the others share the same beliefs that we do. This can become particularly a symptom during technical and administrative review, potentially verifications. And again, I mentioned it to you to just bring your awareness to the situation. So let's go quickly through some of the examples. We'll talk about my lab. Again, we're associated with a law enforcement agency, the Phoenix Police Department. But does that mean that we're a biased organization? No, we have to have autonomy and independence. I'm at one of the highest levels within our police department's organizational structure. I have access to senior leadership over the agency. I am empowered to operate the laboratory in a sound fashion. I have independence and autonomy to make decisions with regard to policy, practice, scientific technical procedures, those opinions, our conclusions. So you have in it, there's a ton of stuff that goes into that to ensuring that we have autonomy and independence. Many of those factors that I've already talked about today, and how to build that system. We mentioned employee onboarding. One of the other things that's unique to our laboratory that we do here is, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well, is this case acceptance policy. What types of cases we'll accept, what we won't accept. We do an evaluation of all the cases submitted to the laboratory, in particular those that are complex. So if it's a seized drug analysis, we're not going to do a formal evaluation, but if it's a homicide case, we utilize a case manager and a liaison. And that case manager is the one that represents the laboratory. It engages with the stakeholders to talk about the evidence that's available for analysis, how we can combine best evidence with best science, to answer the questions that they have about that evidence. And note, I said stakeholders because we do this with the defense too, primarily in post-conviction cases, but that person is independent of the analysts that will be processing the evidence. Those analysts aren't present during that case evaluation, and we limit that access to information. The other thing that we've done, because we have to document those meetings, because it's an actual in-person meeting or virtual meeting, is we're very careful with the word choice that we use when we provide information and document that meeting, so that we don't inadvertently introduce words like suspect that can influence the analysts that are processing the information. We also do something that's called blind reexaminations. So one of the barriers to blind proficiency testing is making a proficiency test look like real evidence. And there's lots of risks and barriers associated with that. So one of the things we do is that we will randomly, on a routine, regular basis, select an item of evidence for every analyst in the laboratory and re-examine it. They don't know which case we're picking. They don't know what item of evidence we're picking. And it's done on an ongoing, routine, regular basis. The person that's doing the re-examination doesn't know the original results. So that's one way that we've incorporated it into our system to help support minimizing and mitigating the impact of bias, but ultimately supporting a high quality work product. The Virginia Department of Forensic Sciences, again, this is an independent institution, performs blind verifications and latent prints. This increases transparency and decreases biases. It's 100% of all their comparison conclusions are verified. So not just identifications, but also exclusions. 10% of those are all blind verified. So the examiner does not know prior to working on the case if it will be selected. Cases with all types of conclusions are randomly selected. Documentation approach helps support discussions relating to differences in opinion, and best practices documenting that discussion. Reasons for the change of opinion are shared and used to improve the process. So as you can see, this is contributing to the overall commitment to continuous improvement for our systems and our laboratories. Two final examples include the Kansas Bureau investigation, where they use sequential unmasking for technical reviews and blood pattern analysis. They start with photos. That's the first thing that the analyst looks at. They don't look at anything else. Then the autopsy reports, then the lab reports, and lastly, the officer reports. So in a sequential manner, new information is introduced to the analyst so they can reach their conclusions. And then ICITAP, I had the honor of participating with this and their efforts to help build forensic science infrastructure across the world. We went to Mexico, and they had their first ever national symposium in which we really talked about how do you build these quality cultures. And what contributes to that effort. We incorporated the ASCLD Leadership Academy that was tailored to the needs of Mexico. And one of the things that comes out of that is this diversity in discussion, and incorporating that and ultimately in the systems that you design and develop. Final thoughts on my part include a commitment. This takes commitment of every individual in the laboratory, but it must be led by leadership. Starts with awareness and an understanding of what bias is, why it's important, why we need to talk about it, why we're building these systems and processes to mitigate the impact of it, and then execution as well. Ultimately, I think that transparency is a key to successfully ensuring that you're minimizing that impact of bias. We talked quite a bit about structure, and I want to emphasize those of you who are with me and your laboratories associated with a law enforcement agency or prosecutor's office. That doesn't mean we're biased. It takes a lot more to have that negative impact on your operations. So building that infrastructure in practice to really live in minimizing the impact of bias. It is an ongoing effort. We never stop this. This isn't a one and done, much like accreditation is. Accreditation processes, quality processes never end, right? We are always engaging in our quality system. And it's the same thing. This just gets incorporated into that overall approach, and it becomes an ongoing effort with a commitment towards continuous improvement to the highest quality work product that we can provide. I encourage you to utilize research to inform your decisions, especially as you build policy and practice. There's a ton of work going on right now that we can rely on to help us make these decisions. It's not just the information available to us in our laboratory, but it's really a wealth of resources that exist within the community now to help us inform our decisions, really utilizing the outcome of research. And so with that, I want to thank you all so much for your time and attention. I've provided my contact information here for any follow-up questions that you may have that we're not able to get to. And here's a list of the resources I utilized for today's presentation. And we'll turn it over for question and answer.
All right. Thank you, Jody, for a fantastic and informative presentation. Before we get into some questions from the audience, I do want to let everyone in the audience know that we have Linda Jackson from the Virginia Department of Forensic Sciences, Lisa Burdett from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and Mark Bogle from the Department of Justice's International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program, all here to answer any specific questions about the earlier examples from their respective organizations. So to not delay any further, first question I have here is, our biggest challenge has been investigators going directly to the analyst with information that could introduce bias. How have others addressed this issue?
Thanks, Tom, for that question. It's a really good question, and I think that it's something that we need to make an explicit decision about, both from a policy perspective and a practice perspective. And I remember the days when I was in forensic biology and I was a brand new screener, and we would reach out directly to the investigators, or the investigators would walk down to our laboratory because we were in the same building as the investigative bureau, and they'd have conversations with us, and they'd ask us questions, or they'd call us, or whatever the case may be. And as we've learned more about the impact of bias and the impact of undue influence, we've really restricted that access to our analysts formally and informally. And so, as I mentioned, in our laboratory, we have a case manager who serves as our liaison to investigations, as well as the courts, our prosecutors in particular. And we've restricted access to those stakeholders directly contacting our analysts. And so they need to go through the liaison, who serves as a mediator and allows and screens that information in a way that we can control and minimize and mitigate that impact of bias. We've found it to be very effective. It allows our analysts to really just focus on their primary mission in the various sections. It has proven to be very successful. It has limited and reduced. So one of the unintended consequences of it is it's really reduced stress for our analysts. having to have a conversation with whoever the stakeholder may be, in which you're imparting information that they may not find very favorable, whether it's how many items you're going to test, what the results were, what your capabilities are in the laboratory. It's really reduced the level of stress that our analysts experience by essentially really limiting access to them by our stakeholders. Now, as the case matures and it moves towards trial, then it becomes a little bit more difficult, but that's typically well after analysis has been completed. And analysts will receive subpoenas, or they'll get calls from paralegals for discovery and things like that, but that's well after that critical time frame in which they're actually processing the evidence. So I hope that answers the question.
I have a question here for the KBI and Lisa. Do you use sequential unmasking in any other discipline, and how do you accomplish the sequential unmasking? Is it through your limb system, a supervisor, or some other limiting factor? Lisa, you may be on mute.
Hello.
There you go.
Good. Hey. So for our bloodstain group, it's a relatively small section. So we have typically 2 that are really active in the casework and 1 who does most of our technical reviews. So when she gets a case to do that technical review, she will look at the photos first and make some determinations there before she begins to look at the other data to help with that, removing the bias that is sometimes, especially with crime scenes and with bloodstain patterns, because you end up with getting a lot of information up front. So otherwise, we right now are not doing it in any other section at the KBI.
Thank you, Lisa. Question I have here for Jody or anyone in the group. Given that people believe that others are biased but not themselves, aka the bias blind spot, how do you get your new employees to really believe that it exists?
I think it becomes, you have to ingrain it as a part of your culture. So that awareness piece of it, and I invite the other panel members to chime in, because we all have a little bit different perspective on it, but it really starts as soon as they walk in the door. And until there's awareness, and you explicitly identify policies and procedures and practices that are directly addressing the impact of bias, employees have an opportunity to ignore it and say, well, I'm not really affected by it. Nobody can escape the impact of bias, because it's the way it's a biological function. And as scientists, we should appreciate that this is the way that our brains process information. You can't escape it. So one of the ways of addressing it is awareness, education, formalization through policies, procedures, ongoing practice, and constant engagement on the topic, and then transparency. Making ourselves transparent is one way to really hold ourselves accountable and ensuring that we maintain that awareness throughout our careers. But I'd like to hear what some of our other panelists, like Mark, who is really engaged with our international community, thinks about that question as well.
Thanks, Jody. This is Mark. Yeah, so our work across the world, and specifically in Latin America, we try to sort of hit that culture more at a national level or a professional level. And so my comment in response to the question would be to encourage the participation into the broader community. I think people are less willing to be trained on bias until they really understand it and accept its relevance on their own first. And I think often that comes more from peer influence than it does from being directed from above. And those are the type of things that we try to do in our programs in terms of set the conditions for that culture to try to make it easier for those lab managers and the supervisors later on. So that would be my comment, and would encourage people to allow their folks to participate in ASCLD or the American Academy, or especially webinars that would provide that exposure. And then that will make the job easier of the managers down the line, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Mark. I have a question here for Linda and the Virginia DFS. Does the blind verification also include inconclusive conclusions? And how do you assign the verification so that the verifier does not know that the prior analyst's results?
Yes, thanks. So all conclusions can be blind verified, and it is they're selected randomly. So definitely it does include inconclusives. And so when an examiner is doing their analysis, they don't know which cases are going to be sent for blind verification. It's automatically selected through Midio, which is the software program that we use. And so the examiner can also choose, say they had a case where there was only like one single latent print or something like that, they could choose to send it to blind verification as well. And so when an examiner is assigned to do a blind verification, they log into Midio using their blind verification credentials, which makes it so that you're in a different part of the system, so that you only have access to the folder with the original images, because they are starting from the original images whenever they are doing a verification, whether it's an open verification or a blind verification. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. I know we are running very short on time. I do want to round out with one final question, but before we get there, because I know some people may have to drop off exactly at the top of the hour, I wanted to let the audience know that we did notice in the chat that there was overwhelming request for Carolyn Gannett's bibliography of cognitive bias articles. And so to save Carolyn from a long day of sending out emails, we will post that document to the webinar, this webinar's registration page, to make it available to everyone here today. We'll do that after the webinar is closed out. So if you navigate back like you did to try and get into the webinar today, you'll see that document is there. I do want to note both disclaimers related to the document, and that is this document is not a product of the FTCOE, and nor is the FTCOE's assistance in disseminating the document and endorsement of its contents or the document itself. And then also just reiterating the document's own disclaimer that it is not intended to be a complete or comprehensive collection, and nor has it been filtered in any way. It's merely a tool to get started in learning about forensic bias. So again, that'll be available here shortly after the webinar's over for anybody that was looking for that or had put their email out there. We're going to go over a little bit, but I do want to wrap up with one final question that I think would be a good one to end on, since we have so many different perspectives here to answer in the panel. And that is, how do we support autonomy and independence when we're a lab attached to a law enforcement agency?
I'll chime in first. I think that one of the things that we've done here is have an explicit discussion with our agency leadership about the importance of the laboratory having autonomy and independence. And what that means, utilizing accreditation as one of the vehicles to build that formality into your system. So with a customer contract and the caveats on what that means and the overall processes, we support that through additional quality system documents. So it can, you start off with an explicit discussion. This is accreditation. This is what it means. We need to have autonomy and independence. At least that was a way for us to introduce the topic with our leadership. And one of the things that we've gone through here at Phoenix is we started, I think, I believe we started in the late 60s as a laboratory. We've gone through having civilian administrators who are technical experts, and then largely through the 2000s, from about 2005 to 3 years ago, it was sworn. And so we've cycled back and forth between sworn oversight and technical civilian oversight. And what has been more successful for our agency is a civilian technical oversight. And I think some of that experience help informs the importance of that and having access to the highest levels within your organization to advocate not only on behalf of being independent and autonomous, but advocating for resources is also important. But I'm going to be, again, in the spirit of transparency, you're still a part of a larger organization. And the police department is still part of a larger organization than that. And that's the city of Phoenix government. And so you can't escape having some primary stakeholder ultimately that you have to answer to. Even when it's a private laboratory, you have shareholders that you have to answer to. If you are an independent forensic science institution, you still have a stakeholder that you ultimately answer to, whether it's a municipality, another government agency like the governor's office. We still have somebody that we answer to, but it's really formally through policy, then practice and education and awareness that you're able to support that independence and autonomy. And when you feel like you're not able to do that, advocate for yourself, speak up. That sometimes that comes with risk, but you have to have the organizational courage and the individual and professional courage in order to really engage in those types of difficult discussions about what that means and how that makes you a better institution, a better forensic science laboratory. Thanks, Tom. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that as well.
This is Linda, and I couldn't even add to that because that was so complete as an answer. But as you know, we are an independent laboratory system in that we don't report to law enforcement or attorney's office or what a district attorney or anything like that. And it's still, as Jody says, I report to the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security. We are a sister agency to the state police, but you still report to someone. And so it really is having the budgetary independence and the quality system independence to act as is fit for the laboratory, no matter where you are.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Jody. Lisa or Mark, do you have anything else you'd like to add, or did Jody seem to cover most of it?
I think Jody nailed it.
This is Lisa, and I have nothing I would add to what Jody said. She did a very good job of describing what we need to do.
All right. Well, double bonus points to Jody for the presentation and wrapping things up with an absolute grand slam of an answer. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up now since we are running a little bit over. And I want to first start with thanking our subject matter experts for taking the time out of their day to present and offer answers to the material for today's webinar. So thank you again, Jody, for taking the time to provide such a wonderful presentation. And thank you, Linda, Lisa, and Mark, for helping us answer some of the questions from the audience. All right. One more thing, just to note again, for anybody who missed it, we will be posting the bibliography of cognitive bias document in the webinar's registration page shortly after this webinar is over. So please come on back to the page in a hour or so, and you'll be able to download that document from there. We would also like to take this time to thank our audience for joining us today. These webinars would not be possible without your attendance and support. Before you leave today's webinar, we would like to ask you to participate in a short survey. You can locate that link back on the webinar's main page. Simply click the word survey, and that will bring up our quick customer satisfaction survey for today's event. Your feedback about our webinars is vital information that we use to provide you with the best webinar experience and adjust the content and the way we disseminate the information to our audience. One more thing to draw your attention to, you should see we are putting links into the chat to all our social media pages, such as Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, as well as a link to our website at forensiccoe.org and a link directly to our podcast episodes. Make sure you are following us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with everything that FTCOE is doing in the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your day.